Thank you, Andy.
I want to get this on the public record that Carol is a leader in the UX field. She has a 20+ year career conducting UX research and interaction design across industries, government agencies, and academia. She is a prolific speaker and teacher. She's spent over 6 years improving AI systems, including current work in the AI division at Carnegie Mellon, and that's in the Software Engineering Institute. And if really, she's not done just that, but Uber Advanced Technologies Group for self-driving vehicles and leading design teams at IBM Watson, just a very, very impressive resume. And again, a really timely talk. I feel like this is the year that if you haven't been asked yet to work on something involving AI, probably you will be soon. And these issues of trust are really, really relevant. So happy to have her. And I will now turn it over to Carol on the navigating the complexity of trust.
Excellent, thank you. And happy World Usability Day, everybody. Just going to get up these slides. All right, so I'm going to be talking about navigating the complexity of trust. A little bit of copyright there. And I do want to acknowledge the land I speak on. This is never enough, but it is important to recognize that the people who are in this region have contributed significantly to to America in general, and specifically to where I am, which is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it's the land of the Monongahela, the Adena, and the Hopewell nations, the Seneca, the Lenape, and Shawnee lands, and the Osage and Delaware and Iroquois lands. And you can see there, my neighborhood's actually on this map, which is nice. So what is trust? We need to just take a moment to think about that, because it's going to be different for each of us. Just a warm-up image here. You can see that these two animals are displaying what might be called trust. The cat certainly doesn't seem concerned about anything that's going on. The dog seems perhaps slightly annoyed. And this is the type of imagery that I think a lot of people have in their minds when they think about trust. Here's another one, a nice scene here with a baby's hand or a young child in the hands of adults, it appears. And we can imagine that this child has the trust that they can be dependent on these individuals. And again, this is something that people often equate with trust. And then thinking about more complex situations where there are machines involved and a variety of different humans, we can imagine how the different factors that need to be considered by the individuals in these situations start to become very complex. So there's the patient who is about to have a procedure done. They need to have some level of trust in the hospital and in the people who are taking care of them, and in the machinery, even in the equipment that they are going to be observed by. The technician needs to have trust in that machine. They need to have trust that the patient themselves is going to be compliant, that the hospital is going to support them, that their job is secure. And then the surgeon also needs to have some trust in the system, that the images that are being displayed are accurate, that that all the information that they have available to them is going to help them to make the right diagnoses or to do the proper surgery, whatever is entailed. So lots and lots of different influences here on these individuals, as well as from the environment. So trust is complex, it is transient, and it is very personal. Each individual is going to have a different idea of what trust means to them, and that is going to change over time. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in this talk. So there are a lot of contradictions that are around us right now, every moment. Many of you are at home and you may have some of these devices around you. And we hold multiple contradictory views about these devices. So if we think about the software that Amazon or Netflix, something like that may make recommendations that reflect our taste, which is great, but we may worry about what that means for privacy. We may use a smart speaker to help us remember things, but lament about losing short-term memory or the privacy of that particular situation. And then news feeds can be biased towards what we want to see, and we may not be getting the broadest news coverage that we want. All of these situations are to some extent about trust and how much evidence we have available to us through these interfaces and through these experiences that have us feeling that we are in a situation that our information or our person is being protected. I do see some chats. I'm going to try to keep an eye on these. Okay. And trust, this is a definition I'm working on, and welcome your feedback. Trust is having enough confidence in positive outcomes that a person gives control of something significant to them to another party. And so that confidence is about having the evidence to understand that the system or an individual is benevolent, that they have integrity, and that they are capable of doing whatever it is that we are giving control of to them for. So there's a lot of information that needs to be presented or conveyed to an individual for them to have that confidence. And so this all involves a lot of different pieces of our understanding. So it's belief and understanding. It's dependency and choice, that we don't necessarily always have a choice, but often we do in who and how we trust others. That there is some aspects of context and privacy in these situations, that we have the perception and awareness of what is going on, that we understand the situation again, and that that evidence that we are knowledgeable about the information that we are providing or the way the information is going to be used. And then there's a lot of emotional aspects here, and respect as well, that the system or the individual that we are communicating with or working with is also supporting us and respecting us in the ways that we need to be respected. And so the words trust itself isn't enough. I really would like to talk about appropriate trust, really thinking about this situation, because as the variations occur in context, and as our confidence in the evidence changes, there is going to be a corresponding adjustment in our level of trust. It's not going to be consistent all the time. You can imagine in your own life, you probably, in some cases, trust an individual more or less. In some cases, you may trust just traffic more or less. All these things in our lives, it's not a constant. These are things that change over time. And again, based on the benevolence, integrity, and capability. So is 100% trust really a goal? This is something that people often talk about. We want to make these systems trustable. But really, what does that mean? And is that even appropriate? How much is appropriate? And can there be too much trust? I believe there can be. Humans are very biased when it comes to computing, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But we need to think about really what is necessary and appropriate for the situation. If people are over trusting of the system, in particular, they may miss some important information. They may not understand that the system doesn't have the context that they have, and they may fail to rely on their own senses, their own awareness to make a decision or to take a next step. And we don't want humans to fail to use their own senses and their own senses of intuition and other things that make us make sensible decisions, responsible decisions. We all make mistakes. No one is perfect, but certainly a human looking at the full context is better than a computer with a very limited view. So we need to think about, how do we communicate that? How do we communicate the appropriate level of trust? Optimal trust is that unnecessarily high trust in AI, and it does often, unfortunately, have catastrophic consequences when they're life-critical applications. So specifically, I'll talk about this in a moment, but with semi-autonomous vehicles, people begin to overtrust those vehicles, and the results are unfortunately really horrible. So optimal trust is not the goal. We want, or 100% trust, I should say, is not the goal. We do want optimal trust, where humans and AI have a level of skepticism, really are looking at each other with awareness of what their capabilities are, and knowing that the other body or the other party is capable of making mistakes, and making sure that that awareness is very clear to the individuals interacting with these systems. So with the semi-autonomous vehicles, we can imagine if you've been in these and use these kinds of lane keeping and those kinds of support systems that vehicles often have now, you have to have a trust in that system, the manufacturing of it, the programming of it, and you also need to have trust in the government, the area that you are in, that road markings and other signals the vehicle is relying on are appropriate and useful. You need to understand the limitations of the vehicle and the capabilities of it, and have a trust that those aren't changing significantly, that it's consistent. And think about where you may need to, again, take over the vehicle and be the person in control. So there's a lot of transitions there, negotiation and communication. And I'll talk about that again in a little while as well. But these require a lot of trust in a very complex system. So automation bias, this is what I was talking about a minute ago, is that propensity for us to favor suggestions from automated decision-making systems. And this means that we're also ignoring contradictory information made without automation, even when it's correct. This is a quote from Mary or Missy Cummings. She's very well respected in AI and ML. And the weakness here of humans in general is that we tend to just trust that. We favor that because it seems simpler. It removes the complexity of having to think and to consider and to be critical. And that's not a good thing. We want everyone to use their critical minds, to really be thinking for themselves, using automation, but not relying on it 100% all the time. So trust is a continuum. There is, on the far end here, distrust, where we have a lower level of trust in the system than it has the capability. So we just don't think it can do what it can do, and then we don't use the system, or we don't think it works correctly, and so we don't use it. There are many ways to think about this trust, but the idea here being that the system does not work the way people expect it to, or they don't think it does, which leads to disuse. And on the far right, there's overtrust, where we, again, are having that bias towards overtrusting the system, thinking it can do more than it can, and allowing it or applying it in ways that was not intended to be used, and misusing the system. And in the middle is calibrated trust, where we're really matching our trust, our level of understanding of the system, that evidence, we have enough evidence that we have a calibrated trust. So it's an appropriate level of trust and appropriate use as well. And again, this changes over time, though. You can imagine a situation where someone, their first experience with the system, they have a medium level of trust, an appropriate level of trust, maybe even. But then that first experience doesn't go well, and they reduce their amount of trust, and then they start teaming with the system, and things improve, and they're feeling very positive about it. And then things might even out over time to be more appropriate for that situation. You can also imagine someone who is over trusting of a system, beginning to use it, and then realizing, oh, maybe it's not working the way they anticipated, and then they start to team, and they over trust again, and then eventually, hopefully, getting to that appropriate level of trust. And then finally, of course, people approaching a first experience with a high level of distrust. Maybe they're concerned about their job. Maybe they're concerned about how it will affect their work or take over their work. And so that ideally is managed and communicated. The information that they need to gain the proper level of trust is communicated, and there's a showing of respect and a balance between their skills and the skills that the system is offering. And ideally, again, we're moving towards this level of trust, but this is going to be different for every individual. And of course, we can't design systems generally for individuals. So we have to think about who we are designing for, and generally what might their level of trust be, and what are the issues that we need to consider that make up that level of trust. So changes will increase and decrease trust, and they might be event-driven. So something may occur, there's an interaction, a transaction, something happens, and that the response changes that level of trust. And more often it's time-driven, where the periodic evidence that the individual is being provided with or encountering builds or reduces their level of trust in the system over time. And a lack of evidence. So if the system's really not providing them with any information about how it's working, why it's making the recommendations it's making, why it's doing the things it's doing, that will of course decay trust over time as well. I mentioned earlier the trust in the cities and other organizations that might be handling road signs and such. This zigzag painting appeared on the street near where I live recently, and no one really knows what it's about. And you can imagine that a self-driving vehicle may get very confused if it hasn't already been trained on this type of road painting. I certainly was. And so thinking about the types of change that could occur and how your system's going to respond to that change is really important as well. Really being speculative about the potential for change and how you will maintain trust and help the person who is interacting with the system understand what is going on and why the system is reacting the way it is really important. So being aware of the system's capabilities might include transparency and usability of the system. Happy World Usability Day. It may be about understanding the conditions and the constraints. So perhaps weather is a factor with autonomous vehicles, perhaps a certain class of individuals can't use a particular type of system because they don't have access to it. Really understanding those kinds of things is important to people using the systems, and having them gain awareness through the experience. Again, that length of time that they use it and the quality of their experience really can help to hopefully have an appropriate level of trust. There are other factors, of course, as well, including the institution and management factors, social and relational factors, who else is using this, who else trusts the system, and their previous experiences. And these systems, no computer system can fix the personal issues, the social issues within an organization. Those really do need to be addressed separately. A system is not going to fix the existing issues that we have. And in fact, unfortunately, because we typically use historical data, they will reinforce existing biases and problems within the system. So be very careful if there are already existing factors. Applying a new system is unlikely to help the situation. It might, but it's unlikely. If you think about a simple image recognition tool, perhaps it is determining what is a fruit and what is a vegetable, and it comes across a tomato. What kind of evidence would you need to provide for someone using this to really have the appropriate level of trust? Would there need to be information there about benevolence? Would there need to be information there about integrity? What would that be? And capabilities, are there limitations? Can this device recognize vegetables and fruits that are of abnormal size? I got an acorn squash last year that was gigantic. Is the system going to not recognize it because it's not within a normal range? How do you convey that information appropriately to people so that they know how the system works and why it's working at a level that, again, is appropriate for their information? So I'll pause there. I haven't seen any questions. Andy, are there any?
We can address any questions that come up after the talk as well. So yeah, I haven't seen any come in yet either.
Okay, great. I will keep going.
But I will, sorry, but good reminder to folks, if you do have questions, throw them in that Q&A and we'll get to them.
Excellent. So to support appropriate trust, we want to really make systems that work with and for people, that are augmenting our abilities, and we want to minimize unintended consequences. And the way to do that is to start, of course, with research to understand the context of use, really understanding the complexities there. Designing for a purpose, we're looking at systems, not just tasks. Really looking too narrowly with more complex systems can be problematic, because one small activity may have repercussions across the system. So you really want to understand the entire system. And of course, testing prototypes and those products in the environment. And my organization has published a paper on human-centered AI that you are welcome to take a look at. And this is all work in progress. We're working to really promote or create, I should say, a national AI engineering initiative to really help people who are doing this work to do it better and to figure out ways of helping people work and make responsible AI and really do the best work they can. Part of that is being speculative, because speculation does keep people safe. So really thinking ahead as far as possible. In that last session, there were a good discussion about thinking, how do you prevent harm? How do you think about what the worst cases are? And the best way to do that is to actually have conversations and think about what is the worst case scenario, and really thinking about that in a meaningful way. Not just assuming that average cases will occur, but really thinking about what will happen if something goes wrong. Can we prevent it? And if we can't prevent it, how are we going to mitigate that situation? How can we communicate about the situation to the right people, potentially reverting the system to a previous version or taking the system offline if necessary? We can't really verify probabilities in the future, so relying on that kind of information isn't helpful. Nancy Levinson talks about not requiring unsupportable risk assessments. Don't focus on probabilities, rather try to make sure that you're aware of the harm that could occur and prevent it if possible, or mitigate where necessary. So the activities that we can do as UX professionals is around UX research, doing activities such as abusability testing. Dan Brown was the one to coin this term a few years ago, and even taking it as far as Black Mirror episodes. This was inspired by the British dystopian sci-fi series. Hopefully you have seen that. And it really takes these imaginative activities to the nth degree in thinking about what misuse and abuse can occur. And those Black Mirror episodes are from Casey Feisler. And we want to do this because, again, we want to prevent unintended, unwanted consequences. And the best way to do that is to think about it, and then to plan and to make plans to protect people and mitigate where possible. So all of this requires a lot of talking, a lot of understanding through conversations. And these can be extremely difficult conversations, but they're so important. Thinking about what you value. I highly recommend adopting a set of technical ethics that the team can coalesce around, and then using that to help you query your system and understand what your system is going to value as far as data or interactions, who could be hurt, what lines the AI system or whatever it is you're building is not going to cross, what won't it do? How are you shifting power between people, between organizations, and how are you going to track your progress? And also, of course, thinking about people who come from historically marginalized groups and how the system may further harm them in situations that you can imagine. So a lot of this is really new and uncomfortable for people, but it's important to get used to being comfortable. Laura Kalbach talks about this. That ethical design is not superficial. We have to have those important, difficult conversations, and we have to have them as early as we possibly can. Anyone who is trying to tell you that they can't tell you why a system does what it does, I would not recommend buying that system or allowing it to be built. We should always be aware of the systems. Now, is that always going to be true? No. If you're building a sock recommender, somebody recommends the wrong sock. If the system does, it's probably not the worst thing in the world. But if you're building a critical system, if you're building a system that larger populations are going to be affected by, you better know exactly how it works and the potential implications of that work, and know how to turn it off and make a reversion to a previous version. Do the work to make sure that you're protecting people. So how do we do this? How do we actually design for trust? This is a model from 2019 talking about trust engineering and looking at some different aspects of it. And it's a nice way to think about a few different areas. So security, adaptability, communication, explainability, training and knowledge and assessment. And you may have heard the word explainability before. There is a DARPA project that specifically is working on explainability. And for them, explainability is looking both at the people who are building the system and making sure that the people building it are building in a way that someone can easily maintain the system and understand the limitations and the capabilities of the system in a programmatic way. So understanding what data it was trained on and why, what the limitations of that data are, looking at the training methods and the models used, the algorithms, et cetera, really having a clear understanding of that portion of it. And then on the other side, looking at the end user's experience, the people who will be interacting with the system, making sure that they have an appropriate understanding of how the system works and why it makes the decisions or recommendations or whatever it does, why it's doing it at that level. So thinking about those two different sides is really important to build a good, responsible system, AI or not. So these experiences need to be safe, and some things to think about are how we're managing these critical things. So if someone needs to get into or maintain a safe state, that should be easy to do. So if you think about your phone, there's some things on your phone that you would want to be able to do very easily. That should be easy to do. And actions that could lead to an unsafe state or hazard, even if it's uninstalling something, that should be hard to do. So thinking about what is easy and what is hard and how many protections are we putting in place to keep those unsafe states, those hazards from occurring or making them at least hard to happen. And not relying on people that are operating systems to be able to detect errors in the moment. It's just not realistic. So again, with more urgent, more critical systems, making sure that they aren't relying on themselves necessarily to protect themselves, and thinking about how do we manage this in a way that helps them and helps them to recover as well after an accident. We want to take pause, because in our enthusiasm to provide measurements, we should not attempt to measure the unmeasurable. I really like this quote again from Nancy Levinson. People believe a calculated number more than the actual experience, so be very careful about using numbers, numerical calculations with regard to confidence or accuracy. These types of numbers can be very misleading when misapplied or misunderstood. And so that is not a good way to communicate the information about the system, unless you're working with people who work with percentages and statistical information on a regular basis. For the average audience, that is not going to be a good way to support their experience. And looking at errors in information, making sure you're creating protections against errors, as we should always be doing, providing self-checks and error detection, error handling. The system should to some extent be robust in this way and be able to support the proper use and identify issues where it's reaching the end of its abilities, or it's having problems, or there's been some data drift. Some of this can be calculated, not all of it, and it still needs to be monitored by a human really throughout its life cycle. This is not, with AI systems in particular, these aren't systems you can just launch and leave alone. They need to be constantly monitored, because as new data gets introduced into the system changes, and it may very well change in ways that you didn't anticipate. And so they must be monitored. And then identify trends and behaviors that are increasing risk. Another great quote: data, big or not, isn't the same as information. There's another great quote about shared information is not shared understanding. The same idea. Just because it is there doesn't mean that people are really absorbing it and understanding it. We want to make systems that are effective team players. Human-machine teaming is really going to be very powerful for all of us, I think, but it has to be easy to direct the system. We need to understand its behavior. It needs to be observable. What is the system doing right now? It may also need to understand what the human is doing right now and how to communicate between the two. how easily and efficiently they are able to direct the system, and thinking particularly about those busy and novel episodes, periods of time when they need to work more quickly or more urgently on a particular issue or topic, and how is that different? How do we need to think about the periods and the work progress during those times? We want to capitalize on human strengths always. This is from a list of machines are better at and humans are better at, but humans are better still generally, and this is general, but perceiving patterns across information. Now, does that mean we're faster? No, but we are very good at perceiving patterns. We're good at improvising and using flexible procedures, recalling relevant facts at the appropriate time. This is something a system can do quickly within a narrow space, but we can do more broadly in many situations. We can do inductive reasoning, and we can exercise judgment. And we have the context and the values and those sorts of things to help us with these types of activities. We want to think about what changes across time. I've talked a little bit about this throughout. Thinking about how long are the interactions? Are they short and hectic? Is there a lot going on at that moment? Or is this a longer, more cyclical type of activity? Is it iterative? Is some work being done and then being built upon? Is more information coming into the system? Dwayne Degler and I spoke about this earlier this year at the IA conference, and really what is required is clear communication, negotiation, and coordination across each stage of the interactions, especially again when humans and machines are teaming together, really exchanging that clear communication, having negotiation where each one is working with the other and trying to attain a goal, and then coordinating towards reaching that goal is extremely important. We need transparency. So explainability, as I already described, that's not magic. We really have to work to do that. And transparency in itself isn't clarity. Really considering what those system limitations are, how are you going to describe the boundaries and unfamiliar scenarios that the humans will encounter, and when they are going to need to intervene or take over or transition between the system and the human is really important. And again, we covered this in our human-centered AI report, or white paper, I should say, a few months ago. So appropriate trust is understanding context and testing in context, making sure that we're doing the work of really looking at people, their interactions, the complexity within those situations, and then using prototyping and other activities to test in that context, making sure that we're making the right system for the right people, designing for purpose, and making sure that we're looking at the whole system, the whole environment, that larger context, and really making sure that we're building for the system-wide situation, providing understandable evidence of the system. So what is the benevolent information that needs to be shared? What integrity information needs to be shared? How can we really show that the system has the capability to do the task? And there's a lot of information out there that you can look at that I didn't talk about today with regard to data. Data sheets for data sets is an excellent model for really questioning the way the system is being built, because these systems are built on large sets of data, and in some cases, many sets of data. Understanding how that is going to come together and potentially expose new information is really important as well. And understanding the provenance of that data that will expose that information is extremely important. How are we going to complement human strengths? And then always providing control to people, making sure that people are always aware of what the system is doing and able to stop it or revert to a previous version if the system is not working in the way they expect, and being able to report anomalies if the system isn't working properly, if the system is providing erroneous information, giving them a way to provide that feedback so that someone can really look at the system and understand what's going on. So we need to design for appropriate trust and think about where the people who are going to be interacting with the system are coming from. What is their level of likely trust? and how are we going to manage that situation throughout those first uses and into their teaming and beyond, and making sure that we're thinking about the things that are important to them and how they are judging the system. And I would love to have some questions. This is my contact information if you'd like to continue the conversation. And I really appreciate being here for World Usability Day.
Thank you very much, Carol. Great talk. And let's get those questions in here. There's nothing yet. So if you're the first to ask, you'll be the first to be answered. I'd love to get some conversations going here, and then we will take a break for lunch, but we have plenty of time left to engage with Carol.
Fascinating topic. Absolutely wonderful. Yeah. I wanted to go back. There was that wonderful image you had of the street with the jagged painted lines on it. Well, that's such an interesting, that was a great metaphor for what you were reaching for.
Yeah, no, and it just appeared. It was the weirdest thing. Those signs, and it's not something I've ever seen in the United States. There are images of it in other countries, but not here. So it's very odd to put that on the street without any
context. Yeah. Looks like
yeah.
we have a couple of questions that have come in. Andy, I'll have you take those over in the chat.
Yeah, sure thing. All right. So as promised, the first question comes first. Vera Schumann says, people often have great intentions. Which of the considerations you mentioned is the most difficult to actually figure out with a product?
So I guess I want a little clarification on that. As far as considerations, is it like, are you thinking about security and safety, or the evidence? I'm not sure if they can provide more context. I think it's all hard. I mean, it's a general answer. Nope. Yeah, so generally it's all hard, and this is work that unfortunately in the software industry and in AI and ML for the most part has not been working much at all. It just hasn't been practiced. So all of it is for the most part new to a lot of organizations, and so that's hard in itself. And then really focusing on thinking about harms is new to a lot of people. They've in many cases been told to not think about that, to protect the organization instead of taking those steps to really be proactive about it. And so unfortunately there's not one thing that's hard. It's all a really hard problems.
Yeah, it looks like also there's a couple of people asking for more information about Zillow. Natalie asks specifically what happened with Zillow. Do you have a news article I could reference? And Lyle adds, are there any lessons to be learned from what recently happened?
Yeah, so and I am not as familiar with the story as I should be to answer that question, but generally my understanding is that they were using a form of AI or machine learning to look at the housing market and then speculating about purchasing homes and then going ahead and purchasing those homes, but also not having enough people available to actually do the work to make those homes worth more. And so they ended up upside down on those homes, is my vague understanding of that. And so generally they weren't paying attention. Nobody was watching the shop, which you have to do anyway, but especially with artificial intelligence and other complex systems, just setting them up and pushing the button go is not ever going to be appropriate for these systems. They really need the sanity, the humanity to look at this and say, you know what, maybe we shouldn't buy 300 houses in that neighborhood. Those kinds of checks on reality are really important, and it is not something a computer system at this time and likely in the future can do as well as a human can.
Right. I'm going to hit Q&A now. Keep those questions coming, and I think we'll probably have time to get to most of them, but There's a question about just research. I noticed you credited studies on most of your slides. Is this currently a hot topic for research?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, yeah. It has been for a number of years. Not as much in industry, unfortunately, but yes, yeah. There are a lot of people doing work on this. There's some wonderful authors. I can share a link to some resources. There are lots and lots and lots of people doing work in this area. It's hard though to get the attention. It's starting to happen, but it's been very slow. So here's a link to some other resources, some wonderful, wonderful people doing work in this area.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Then Dante Vono asks, you mentioned people are more likely to trust calculations and numbers. Do you think this is a good reason to avoid using phrases like "I'm 95% certain" when we really just mean we're pretty sure?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, as much as you can use plain language to explain things like that, the better. Too many people just don't really understand what those numbers mean, and yeah, it's more confusing. Even if they feel it's clear, it's actually more confusing.
So we should all give it 110% to really improve in
Right.
that area, right?
Definitely.
That, and I give it 3 thumbs up. Yes.
Hannah asks, using semi-autonomous vehicles as an example, how do you design to counteract cultural assumptions, i.e. consumers calling them self-driving vehicles in shorthand when that isn't really the case? How do you balance making the user second guess their own level of trust to increase safety?
Yeah, that's a lot of question. I think it is appropriate, if I understood the question, for a human who is sitting in the driver's seat to call them a driver still, because they are still 100% responsible for that vehicle and its operation. None of the vehicles available to consumers right now are systems that you should ever take your hands off the wheel of. They are not capable of what some of them call full self-driving. That doesn't exist. Those systems can come offline unexpectedly and do not necessarily comprehend the situation as well as you do. So there's that. We are all still drivers. If you're in a car, you're a driver. And then the other question was, how do you convey that information? And some of the systems do a better job than others. It depends. It's very contextual. How much do you want to distract the individual to a screen versus to the road? Thinking about the regular distractions that they already have, and what information is really important at that moment is the key. Is do they need to know that the window washer fluid is nearly empty in an emergent situation? No. And really trying to prioritize what at that moment is the necessary focus and what is not, and trying to reduce that visual or auditory complexity as much as possible, particularly in emergent situations. I don't know if that quite answered the question.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think so. Hannah provides a little additional information here saying balancing making the user second guess their own level of trust with actually encouraging the user to consume your product. So I guess feeling that level of safety and comfort with actually engaging with it.
Yeah, so I think so if I understand correctly, it's how do you help them to be skeptical in an appropriate way. And I think that's through integrity, being honest, being clear, providing evidence of the information. People, I think, do recognize when a product is the real thing versus trying to obfuscate the situation, trying to just market their way to your trust versus actually being a good system. So I think that sense of honesty is really key in getting people to adopt your system. Even when your competitors aren't doing that, I think honesty is always the best policy.
Yeah, sort of similar, and I think this is something that probably a lot of us can relate to. Yihan Wu asks, this is a great reminder of what we need is optimal trust instead of 100% trust. However, for new products, it's actually to build any trust. Do you have any recommendations on how to make new users trust a new digital product at the first glance. And there's an example visiting a website of an organization.
Yeah, it's going to depend. You really need to know your audience to understand what their thoughts and concerns are. What are their fears? How are they thinking about this product versus another product? And providing them with the appropriate information. It's really tough to answer without more context. But yeah, I think it's important for them to have enough information, doing simple usability studies and things like that to get an understanding of if you've got the right type of information there. Is probably the best way to understand that.
Mm-hmm. Renee Otto asks, Carol, do you have any recommendations as to how to graciously engage in conversations with leadership in one's organization when you know that the human contribution to the evolution of the digital products we make is less valued than the tech and data informing the tech is? Yeah,
and that's really hard. I think as people understand more what the capabilities and limitations of the systems are, the more they'll understand that while you may replace certain individuals' jobs, these systems require a lot of support and maintenance and monitoring, and so the cost benefit may not be as obvious. They may think there's a benefit, but once they understand how complex these systems are, I think they are likely to be, I would hope, more respectful of the contributions that humans provide. There's very little that can be automated without a significant group of individuals supporting these systems.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, the part of that is just a respect problem with respecting humans, and a lot of organizations probably eventually will have a rude awakening, but it's tough. If they don't respect the people, it's probably not going to work well.
Jonathan Mann chimes in here too, something that I noticed as well. He said, it's interesting that some of the studies you cite are actually contrary to ones Lisa and I cited, where we showed that many have low trust in algorithmic recommendations, and you cite someone who said there tends to be higher trust. That's interesting. How do you explain that?
Yeah. I mean, research is research, and different individuals come up with different understandings. It depends. I'm certain how those studies are run. So if you ask someone, do they trust an algorithm right now? I can guarantee you that they will probably have a lower response rate, that they would say less due to just news and things like that. But if you offer them options between a human's idea and the computer's automated, I think you see a difference in opinion. So it depends very much how the studies are done and who's doing them, et cetera. That's I don't know offhand, but I'm completely confident that you could do 3 different studies and get 3 different answers. But I do believe that humans tend to trust information provided on the screen, as shown by I saw it on the internet, than they do necessarily in their own thought process. Like, is my neighborhood dangerous? My Ring doorbell tells me every day my neighborhood's dangerous. Wait a minute, has any crime ever occurred that I'm aware of on the street in front of my house? No. What's going on here? I do think that people, because of the way information is presented, and because it's presented often in a very urgent or personal way, even if it's not true, people tend to believe it. And that's unfortunately been shown over the past number of years with misinformation on the internet as well.
Right. Yeah. And a good reminder, I think, to that your users are unique to your product, and your product is different from other products. So test and verify.
Yeah.
I've got a few more questions coming in here. Actually, those are mostly just thank yous. There's a comment from Hannah too. In marketing, we also need to be very careful in regard to honesty while talking up the product. I agree.
Yeah, really difficult, because just a simple word change can really help, make people misunderstand what a system's capable of. It's very difficult right now to convey the excitement and enthusiasm that everyone, I think, at least I have, for new technology and the future of being able to use systems and to have much more ability to find the articles I need to find, et cetera. But also to temper that with realistic expectations.
Right. Elizabeth says, I would have loved to see an example of before and after application of trust that you find compelling.
Yeah, and I should have included something like that. I will look for an example. They're not allowed before and after. I can't show a lot of the work I do, but I can definitely work towards finding something. Yeah, so that's a great point.
All right, and then there's one more question, kind of interesting, which is, in my experience, programmers have a distrust towards people. How can I convince them otherwise?
Yes, no, there's definitely there is that bias on the other side, that computers will do better than the humans, and that people don't necessarily know what they want, or they don't, and all that. And I think, as unfortunately as UX professionals, we've seen that throughout our careers, and that's unfortunately a lot of this work is going to run into the same kind of problems, where the work that we tend to do in user experience, in ethics, in accessibility, a lot of these issues, unfortunately, are dismissed frequently by certain individuals, and it's a big challenge. I'm very hopeful with the computer science programs that are currently pushing more ethical classes, and really having those hard discussions in the classes, that we're going to see this next batch or generation of computer science people really much more aware, and thinking more about the human experience, and how important it is to make things that are trustable in an appropriate way, and that interaction, what happens between the human and the machine, is really important.
Yeah. Well, we've got a few more minutes. I mean, technically we go until 12:30, so I'll give folks a few more moments if they want to add more questions for Carol. And meanwhile, I'll just kind of go into my spiel here and let everyone know where we're at. So once we're done here, we're going to go on a longer break. We'll come back at 1 o'clock Central for our next session. So we'll have time to leave for lunch and do whatever you need to do. We're kind of wrapping up our morning programming here. Again, I'm going to remind everyone that if you registered for this event, and you did because you're here, then you have a free code for registering for our happy hour event. And we'd love to see you there tonight. It's at 6 o'clock at Finnegan's. Carol won't be joining us because, as she shared at the beginning, she is not local to the area, but hopefully we'll see some of our other presenters and participants there. And I have seen registration go up. So I'm going to keep saying this because it seems to be working, and we're really, really happy to see people there in person. So I don't think, well, let me call out our sponsor one more time. I promised to do that. So thanks once again to Optum for promoting and supporting UXPA Minnesota and World Usability Day, and they're helping to pay for those pizzas and drinks that we're enjoying tonight. So come along and take advantage of that. And otherwise, I'm not seeing anything else come in for Carol, just a lot of thanks and claps. So let's give it up for her in the chat, and thank her again for coming out and participating today. Really loved having you here.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm sorry to miss out this evening, but have fun for me.